Hello everyone. This is perhaps the heaviest and most complex topic I've covered yet on this channel. And I've spent some days thinking about what I was going to say and put this together, so hear me out. There won't be any fancy graphics or edits to this video. It'll just be me talking, and anything extra, any items I mention or I think are valuable will go in the description section below. And if there's things you want me to add, valuable resources, you can always put it in the comments as well. So I appreciate your engagement. And I do appreciate the sudden mass interest in the issue of racism, particularly anti-Black racism in North America, particularly the States, and the interest in movements that have been fighting against this issue for some time, such as BLM, Black Lives Matter. And in some ways, it's very unfortunate that another gross death had to take place in this manner for mass mobilization. And here I'm referring to what happened to George Floyd in Minnesota. As someone who studies issues such as race and culture in an academic setting where a lot is said about it, in the social sciences, particularly I study the South Asians and South Asian diaspora. I'm happy at so much sudden conversation, engagement, and such. And personally, as someone who grew up in a super diverse city like Toronto, Canada, in the hood and in an immigrant family and community where it was predominantly, blacks and browns, this means a lot to me, this issue. So I had to share my 2 cents on it. And you know what? I understand, I know some of you that are aspiring academics, that there's many shades of black and brown. These are by no means uniform groups, but sometimes to make powerful arguments that, don't separate people but unify people, sometimes you have to clump things, the parts, into the whole. And other people use words such as minorities or colored people, and we can debate all day over definitions and meanings until the cows come home. And you've seen what is happening in the streets, in homes, in communities. And I wanted this video to be more unifying than it is divisive, but at the same time caution some of our own biases and lack of knowledge, and use this heightened awareness to refine some of our understandings and how we engage with the issue of anti-Black racism and racism in more general. And let's be real, there's serious issues within the South Asian communities in North America. And have you ever heard the saying that, change starts within yourself, change starts at home, change starts in your community. So let us address our own problems first before we act heroic or, try to help others out. At the same time, you show love, you get love. So if there's other struggles, one day they'll help you out when you run into a wall. As South Asians here in North America, we need to recognize first the critical role of minority struggles, because we are so readily, define ourselves as minorities, and how minorities are pitted against each other using myths such as model minority. Immigrants are also, increasing. We tend to be at crossroads and strife with other subjugated populations such as the indigenous groups, and some of these differences, we need to talk about them. We really need to air them and work toward reconciling them. Sometimes we as South Asians, we carry out stereotypes against our very own people and other minority groups around us, that somehow, coming back to the model minority myth, that somehow we're superior because we're brown, or we deserve our success more than other colored people and minority groups do. And these things are very much systemic. I'll speak a little bit to systems and systemic racism a little bit later, but you see the anger and the frustration in recent days on your TV screens. You see it in the news, you see it in the streets, but these problems, talking about systems, they didn't happen yesterday, they didn't happen last month, last year, last decade. These are grievances that span centuries that need to be recognized, that blacks in America just as also indigenous populations here, they have grievances from colonialism and colonial era that span many centuries. They are haunted by the brutal legacy of colonialism on these very lands in North America. And these systems and legacies cannot be done justice to in a single YouTube video. So, if you really are interested, I implore you to look into 2 books that really will shape and reshape your understanding of these grievances. And they explain in depth the brutal legacies and how the systems of discrimination still persist today, and how blacks continue to be subjugated on the continent. And these 2 books are, one is Howard Zinn's A People History of the United States, and the other is Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, and I will be linking both in the description below. Once again, if you have other books or resources you're keen to share, I do highly encourage comments. And it is true that many Asian groups too bear the brutality of colonial legacies back home in the lands we came from, or if you're Japanese or Chinese, here too in the New World, where they were put into concentration camps, forced to build railways, and if not slavery, and indentured laborers. And South Asians too were brought over as indentured laborers to the Caribbeans to work on plantations, but then they were pitted against the blacks because of this difference in indentured labor versus slaves, and given a little bit of a more status by the colonial rulers. But this divide and conquer, it's a very old strategy of the colonial apparatus, pitting browns versus blacks, and indigenous versus browns, and indigenous versus blacks, and all these other maneuvering divisive tactics. And a poison of this legacy is the self-hate embedded in our very psyches. And what do I mean by that? If you are into academic works, difficult to read sometimes, there's books that talk about, how colonialism, it continues to damage the psyches of the colonized many generations later. I implore you to look at Edward Said's great book, Orientalism, or also Culture and Imperialism, which explain at great lengths how colonialism can taint the psyches of the colonized to the very way they think and act, and the very way they relate to each other, and how they navigate the world. If you grew up in a South Asian household in North America, you will have heard all types of racist things, assuming ill of other people of color, and even our own people, unfortunately. I grew up first-hand experience in one of the hoods here in a very diverse, multi-ethnic cities, and it really was minorities fighting over these scraps of society and really find their come up and their way out of this socio-economic situation. And these material struggles for the scraps can sometimes make us bitter towards each other. In your own household or family parties, you may have heard all these stereotypes against blacks, Chinese, or even other South Asians, and often we let these slide, which the time has come that we stand up, and hopefully more than sharing a black box on IG, that you'll have the courage to speak up and challenge some of these stereotypes. Sometimes it's blatantly racist stereotypes such as black people are dangerous, or black people do gangs and drugs. This is more common in my perception among the older generation than the younger generation who grew up here. But don't worry, younger generation, I am coming to you next. We, young or old, brown or black or whatever, we are the direct beneficiaries as immigrants from the civil rights movement, and in these states that were led by Black American and icons. Some of them have become icons for their struggles. And these benefits pour over to the whole continent. Canada itself had slavery as well. It also subjugated indigenous people, Chinese, Japanese, and other Asian groups. So I'm sure you have heard of leaders of the movement such as Malcolm X, MLK, Rosa Parks, Muhammad Ali, and their fight for equality and justice for all colored folks. Any colored group, black or not, owe it to sacrifices by them and the loyal followers who sacrificed everything, their life, for this greater freedom justice, and equality. Fast forward decades later, we readily consume and benefit from, black culture and subcultures, such as some of the finest rap, hip-hop, some of the best comedy and cultural elements, such as movies, and even doing dressing up a certain way, doing our hair a certain way, certain type of speaking style and lingo, and the whole 9 yards. Not to open up a whole debate about cultural appropriation, but you should at least recognize where you got your style, lingo, and swagger from, especially for those of you that claim to grow up in some hood. And I also wanted to touch on South Asians, and besides racism, we divide ourselves with colorism, and preferring people of the very same ethnic background with lighter skin over those with darker skins. I know colorism and such biases run deep in the South Asian psyche, and we need to acknowledge that. Now I get that colorism and racism are not one and the same, but it is still a shallow way of looking at the world, and one can lead to the other quite quickly. And this leads to this point, I'm from Canada, as I mentioned before, is that, we argue here that there's not as much racism. Sure that it might not be explicit, but don't judge how little implicit or systemic racism there might be, because it continues to prosper here. Both implicit and systemic racisms are worth talking about very quickly, and I want to hear your views on how they exist in the comments. And these forms of racism, they continue to prosper in a place like Canada, which is known globally for, tolerance and inclusivity. If not, then ask yourself why blacks as a group are more likely to be in poverty or living in a tough neighborhood. Why are they more likely statistically than the average Canadian to be carted on the street or end up in jail for even the pettiest of crimes? Implicit racism, kind of like colorism, is the subtle way we are racist, or we become racist, so subtle that we might not consciously even know it. And our subconscious mind, it makes many decisions for us. In fact, I remember reading somewhere that 40% of human behaviors are dictated surely by habit. And hate and racism, it's definitely taught generally in our society, if not within our own households, where we come to instantly associate black with bad and white with good. If you want, you can mess around with this implicit association test, IAT, online to understand how the human mind is so easily shaped by society and how we come to harbor such implicit biases, and that can make us racist without even knowing, and whether we admit it or not. So I was recently reading this book on big data, and it explores online searches such as, Google searches, because remember that people do perceive the internet as a place where identities are anonymous. So that's where they go and show their true colors, things they might not say in the real world. And this book, entitled Everybody Lies, I also put it in the description below, reveals some of the gross truth about how rampant implicit racism is in the United States by looking at trends for Google searches and what people are searching online, where they air all their dirty laundry. So the filth that people are too scared, the racist filth, to say in public explicitly, that will be deemed racist right away, they go on and tell Google that through their searches. And truth be told, racism remains embedded in implicit and systemic ways within North American society, especially anti-black racism. Whereas any steps forward the black community takes, they're forced 2 steps back by the powers that be. And I genuinely hope that this serves as a tipping point for the better. I have shared some valuable resources down below in addition to the books I've mentioned. And I do hope you'll invest some time and effort into learning more about these issues and terms that I have brought up. And thank you if you watched till the end. And I hope to see you on my channel in my other videos. Take care.